All right, well, hello everyone, and welcome to a symposium that has been some 7 years in the making. I'm Anna Smith, Curator of Education, and I am delighted to kick us off today. If you somehow missed it, maybe you were very engrossed in your phone, our museum has been transformed into an examination, celebration, and radical redefinition of land art, focused on the work of 12 phenomenal artists who happen to be women. For today's program, we will hear scholarly perspectives from 4 authors of our Groundswell Women of Land Art catalog: Jenni Sorkin, Scout Hutchinson, Anna Lovett, and Jana Lebraska. This is the gorgeous catalog, by the way, which is available upstairs, not to be missed. After those presentations, we'll take a short break and reconvene for an artist panel featuring exhibition artists Lita Albuquerque, Alice Aycock, Patricia Johanson, Mary Miss, and Jody Pinto. Moderating that conversation will be Dr. Lee Arnold, Associate Curator at the Nasher and Curator of Groundswell. I know that this has been a labor of love for her and that sharing this work with all of you is a truly special moment. For anyone wanting longer bios of our presenters today, you can find them via the QR that leads to the event page on our website. I also want to give the obligatory reminder to please silence your phones. Please. We have a lot of ground to cover, so let's hit the ground running. I promised Lee at least one ground pun. So please join me now in welcoming Lee Arnold. Professor, oh. Did everybody hear all of that? I was a cheerleader, so, my voice carries. Jenni Sorkin, Professor of History of Art and Architecture at the University of California, Santa Barbara, delivering a paper today titled Structured Power. Thanks, come on up.
There's the screens. All right. Hi, everybody. It's so nice to be here today. I really want to thank the Nasher Sculpture Center for hosting this, for embarking on this show, and especially Dr. Lee Arnold, colleague and friend extraordinaire who has been planning this show for many, many years, and I have been very honored to be a partner in dialogue with her and Jana Lebraska in thinking through this show. And it's lovely to be here with all of you today. I think of this exhibition as overcoming the problem Alice Aycock set forth in 1974 with stairs. These stairs can be climbed, which has always seemed to me to embody the conflict that women artists faced in their aesthetic ambitions, building the whole way to the ceiling. But rather than view it as a deterrent, instead they set about finding a workaround or different way forward, urging that yes, these stairs can be climbed. I congratulate Lee, as this exhibition is a long time coming. And for the women represented in this show, I am thrilled it has occurred in your lifetimes. It is so moving to me that you are here to see it, as so many women never receive the recognition they deserve while they are still living. The very notion of women artists using land itself as a primary artistic tool is antithetical to the history of female representation. Throughout the history of modernism, landscape painting often contained images of nude, semi-nude, or cavorting women. In 1983, the art historian Joshua C. Taylor observed that, quote, "the association of sentiment with landscape was strong in America," end quote. While he was referring specifically to US landscape painting, the ideological linking of gender with emotion meant that women artists, especially, had to reject anything that reeked of even the slightest hint of sentimentality. While abstraction became an enticing way to overcome or short-circuit figuration, women's land-based work had to be particularly calculated and conceptualized, hewing closely to the tenets of minimalism in order to be taken seriously, such as a commitment to elemental geometries like the grid and the line seen here, or seriality as repeated forms and processes. Simultaneously, an imposition and an expansion, gender drove a wedge into the dialogue around avant-garde sculptural practices of the 1960s and 1970s. To date, more ink has been spilled on the sometimes contentious terminology around land art than on the lack of gender parity, both in opportunities for these artists and in the historiography of the movement itself. Most accounts of land art have skirted the sexism endemic to its development, but the social topography of land art was as complex as its geospatial landscapes. Trained as artists and largely self-taught in the realms of architecture, urban infrastructure, and cartography, women land artists had to make inroads through deeply gendered, often hostile spaces just to procure the materials they needed to produce their outdoor sculptures. Beyond the usual challenges of securing gallery representation or critical attention, this meant also being constantly rebuffed or belittled when making direct inquiries into sourcing and buying industrial materials and supplies, or learning the local ordinances and policies of permitting and land use. Land art was one of the true foils for women sculptors, as the politics of its practice were steeped in a world of men, arguably more macho even than the New York art world. Beverly Buchanan, who produced site-specific concrete sculptures, left New York in 1977 to expand her sculptural practice, excited by the possibility of more space. Born and raised in South Carolina, Buchanan embarked upon a reverse migration, returning to the South after a decade in New York in order to create land-based works. She settled in Macon, Georgia, where she produced her best-known installation, Ruins and Rituals, from 1979 at the Museum of Art and Sciences, an environmental work comprising cast and found concrete. Buchanan's installations resemble an abandoned and forgotten cemetery, a means of commenting upon the presence and permanence of Blackness within the landscape of the American South. Its siting at the museum's idyllic arboretum reveals the area's ugly history, as it was then named for Harry Sitwell Edwards, one of the early 20th century's most popular pro-slavery writers, who was a local Macon resident. In an unpublished article on her work, Buchanan recounted to an interviewer the casual sexism she encountered in her interactions with male contractors on job sites in her own artistic practice. Quote, Buchanan liked to tell how Burke Slocum, president of Georgia Steel, donated the equipment and labor needed to arrange the grouping of concrete footers for Ruins and Rituals. She laughs when she tells how the foreman placed his hard hat on her head and said, "We'll move these things as many times as you want us to and put them wherever you say. We were told you would probably change your mind a lot and to treat you like a woman moving furniture." End quote. Contractors were men, heavy equipment operators with commercial driver's licenses, concrete mixers and crane operators, forklift drivers and freight haulers were men. Skilled tradespeople like electricians, carpenters, and stonemasons were men. In a sector rife with gender bias, the obstacles to access such labor and skill were often insurmountable. Money was also a consistent barrier. Women artists lacked the same access to the marketplace or patronage that a gallerist like Virginia Dwan could provide. Dwan underwrote many expenses for her male artists, including the cost of Robert Smithson's spiral jetty in Utah's Great Salt Lake. At times, she also provided living stipends to the male artists in her gallery stable, like Carl Andre or Charles Ross, or even housed them in her Malibu home for informal residencies. These hopelessly entangled relationships expose the privilege and structure of heteronormative situations in which women artists would never be welcomed. According to the art critic Jessica Dawson, Dwan, quote, funded them generously and indulged their whims while asking little in return. For her, sales were happy accidents, not a foregone conclusion, end quote. Institutional patronage was also a primary means of support directed toward male artists. The German dealer Heiner Friedrich, who co-founded the Dia Art Foundation in New York in 1974, had previously commissioned Walter de Maria's first on-site earth rooms in Munich and held the first European exhibitions of Carl Andre, Michael Heiser, John Chamberlain, and Dan Flavin. These relationships with male artists carried over once Dia was established in the United States. De Maria's work was the first artistic commitment the foundation made, sponsoring and maintaining 2 long-term installations in Soho, one of which you see here, the New York Earth Room from 1977, as well as the Broken Kilometer from 79, and also the Lightning Field from 77, which is also tended by Dia in a remote part of New Mexico. This was followed by a permanent exhibition space devoted entirely to Flavin, the Dan Flavin Art Institute in Bridgehampton, Long Island, initiated in 1983, as well as the acquisition of Smithson's spiral jetty. Add to this the lack of institutional support and the long-standing prejudice against women in sculpture itself, and it wasn't until 2018 that Dia acquired a work of art by a woman land artist, Nancy Holt's Sun Tunnels. And just for levity's sake, it is worth showing you this wonderful parody of the New York Earth Room, made in miniature scale of brownies, and another of Holt with beer cans. Because Dia takes itself so seriously, I cannot help but teach these slides together. The New York critic Lucy Lepard was the first to chart the contributions of women engaged in abstract sculpture. Her landmark exhibition, Eccentric Abstraction, curated at Fishbach Gallery in New York in 1966, provided an important visual assertion of the biomorphic and sensuous tendencies of women artists, though several men were also included. Or, as she wrote, describing Eva Hesse's contribution, quote, omitting excessive detail and emotive color, but retaining a tentative, vulnerable quality in the simplest forms, end quote. This was followed by 10 structurists in 20 paragraphs from 1968, one of the earliest essays published internationally on the subject of minimal art, in which Lepard characterized sculptural characteristics in relation to gender. Quote, the formless forms or neutral units used by these men, bricks, grids, square plaques, tetrahedra, progressions, do not draw attention to themselves as form so much as they add up to a whole form that is a shape rather than an image, end quote. Perhaps we think of women working in reverse then, a form that is a fragment rather than a whole. Beverly Buchanan's cast concrete blocks in Untitled Frustula from 1978 simulate the affect and residue of broken columns or benches. Maren Hassinger's Blanket of Branches, for instance, is an accrual of twigs and sticks. Michelle Stuart and Meg Webster utilized site-specific and found earth respectively, merged and commingled. But fragmentation is also one of the core concepts of modernity. Urbanism and its overwhelming sensory experiences created a century of fragmented bodies, inattention, and a lack of wholeness as a consequence of new forms of visuality. For instance, glimpsed reflections in the side mirror of a parked car or shop window, or jump cuts within an action movie. The female body, in particular, has been subjected to fragmentary, often eroticized treatments in art and cinema. In turn, women sculptors sought out and contributed a distinctive approach to fragmentation through a series of repeated gestures, growing their own sequences and processes through an accrual of forms: casting, collecting, shaping, stacking, heaping, repetitive mark-making, and other kinds of accumulation. This methodical approach is a particular formal conceit, an amassing of both sequence and form, indicative of time, labor, and repetition. By assimilating but altering the hard-edged vocabulary of minimalism, women's sculptural practices enlarged the possibility for affect, or feeling and emotion. Arguably, it was women whose sculptural works forged new pathways in abstract sculpture, both indoors and outdoors, proving they could make meaning in the world without sacrificing the medium's exquisite formalism. While institutional support and gallery patronage proved elusive for women land artists, residencies and commissions through sculpture parks, university museums, and public art programs created new opportunities to develop their practice. During the 1970s, site specificity, art installed in nature, and the experience of place all became prominent features propelling forward large-scale artworks by women. At newly established sculpture parks in New York State, such as Storm King Art Center, seen here, and Art Park in Lewiston, interaction between the general public and artists was one of the main investments. Advancing cultural opportunities through educational programming, performance, and film screenings. Art Park, in particular, on the American-Canadian border, adjacent to the majestic Niagara River Gorge in western New York, was a state-funded venture that invited a gender-balanced range of national and local artists while encouraging experimentation and impermanence. As an outdoor cultural center located in the small town of Lewiston, it fostered an ethos of exchange with local community members, putting forward what the curator Sandra Furman has called an outdoor populist agenda. For an artist residency program that largely occurred during the spring and summer months, Art Park regularly invited artists to spend a set number of hours a day on site. This was a requirement. Artists also participated in regularly scheduled activities to help encourage repeat visits in order to solidify true communal bonds with park audience members. Free workshops for families, teens, and children, craft demonstrations, Native American ceremonies and powwows, and seasonal musical and theatrical programming were the backbone of a diverse community that also offered less mediated access to nature through hiking trails and open space intended for day trippers and outdoor enthusiasts. This was a very different ethos from the isolationist tendencies of male land artists, such as Michael Heiser, Charles Ross, and James Turrell, who worked alone in the landscape, swallowed by vast tracts of land in remote parts of the West, Nevada, New Mexico, and Arizona, respectively. A tendency that extended, ultimately, the idea of the male genius alone in his studio. At Art Park, Alice Aycock, Agnes Denes, Maren Hassinger, Nancy Holt, Mary Miss, Jody Pinto, and Michelle Stuart were all invited to make site-specific sculptural works. One of Stuart's most iconic works that you see here, Niagara Gorge Path Relocated from '75, was, for instance, created for Art Park expressly. The artist unfurled muslin-backed rag paper like a scroll down a steep escarpment, then utilized the technique of frottage or rubbing to transfer the impression of the rocks and the red iron oxide of the earth itself to indelibly alter the paper. Moreover, the work introduced the possibility of transfer. The site itself could be conveyed off-site and later shown as a document of intimate, direct contact with the land. The University Art Museum also became one of the few spaces that supported non-traditional sculptural projects by women, exemplifying the role of an inviting institution. This was entirely the result of sympathetic women curators who likely understood and perhaps themselves experienced the exclusions endemic to the field of modern and contemporary art. Two examples I can offer here are the Allen Memorial Art Museum at Oberlin College in Ohio and Western Washington University in Bellingham. At the Allen Museum, Ellen Johnson, an alumnus of Oberlin and an artist herself, was a visionary curator who invited women artists to campus to create temporary on-site artworks. Among them was Mary Miss's Untitled 1973, in which the artist incised a modestly scaled 7-foot square depression in the museum's front lawn. Suggestive of a snare or an animal trap, Mrs. Cuts were level with the grass and therefore well disguised, offering little warning of the work's presence, partly for aesthetic reasons, but also potentially to prevent an unwitting pedestrian from taking a nasty fall. Its 2-foot cavity was lined with a layered lattice structure that was in visual dialogue with the grid-like windows of the museum opposite the sculpture. As Miss later recalled, quote, "I was kind of reacting against the earth artists, or I didn't feel sympathetic to them because I thought it was too much like using the desert as a canvas, and gestural," end quote. During the 1970s, male artists such as Anthony Caro, Lloyd Hammerall, Robert Morris, and Mark DeSuvero were invited to contribute pieces to a burgeoning outdoor sculpture collection on the campus of Western Washington. Nancy Holt here, too, was the first invited woman artist in 1976. After several site visits and collaborations with scientists at the university, she completed stone enclosure rock rings from 77 to 78, an artwork that remains permanently on view and was the centerpiece of a 2022 exhibition at the Western Gallery on that campus. Periodic sculptural commissions from other women followed. Mia Westerlund-Rusin from 78, Beverly Pepper from 83, Alice Aycock in 87. But it was not until 1988 that the outdoor sculpture collection itself became more nationally visible, owing to the investments of Sarah Clark Langager, its first full-time director and curator. Clark Langager initiated educational tours, authored brochure texts, conducted campus outreach programs, and instituted a more democratic selection process for acquisitions. Artists were invited to submit proposals to a large committee of professionals beyond the university, including external artists and representatives from the Washington State Arts Commission. In 1990, Meg Webster produced Lifted Conical Depression, a center-sloping earthwork situated within a copper ring for the collection and chosen by this external committee. As a way to move beyond the confines of the art world, many women artists turned to public sculpture as the 1970s progressed. Working at the intersection of ecology and feminist performance art, the San Francisco artist Bonnie Ora Shirk began developing a 7-acre working farm known as The Farm, within a tract of vacant space below Highway 101's interchange at Potrero and Army Streets. The project was conceived as a green space in order to transform urban blight and offer participatory experiences in both arts and agriculture, fostering the simultaneous cultivation of food and artistic innovation. Community and school groups learned to plant, weed, and farm while buildings on the property were rented at a low cost to non-profit theater and mime groups. Guided by feminist principles rejecting hierarchies of power, the farm is an early artistic foray into multi-species ethnography, meaning that alliances are forged between plants, animals, and people with equity as a core value rather than privileging anthropocentrism or the human experience solely. This same instinct toward interspecies parity also guided Patricia Johanson's Fair Park Lagoon, an important example of an artist engaged